You're not spending enough money. That's right, you heard me correctly. The government needs you to get out there and spend every last dime. Take that credit card and max it out. Why? Because the government needs more taxes. They need the tax coming in so that they can fund their Ponzi scheme. Well, that's what we'll talk about today. Some states are getting hit really hard right now as people start pulling back on their spending. That's what we're going to discuss, how the debt levels are rising, consumers aren't doing what they used to do before. This has a direct impact on the government and what they are able to accomplish. I will bring you more in this video, but I wanted to begin by looking at inflation still hitting certain states particularly hard. And of course, it's going on everywhere. It's not just in the United States. And I'm going to break that down, but I wanted to show you this first because this is the reason why. While state coffers remain buoyed by high sales tax collections this year and record income tax receipts in 2021, changing consumer spending patterns and high prices have triggered a decline in revenues for one of the state's key funding sources. At the same time, the stock market volatility threatens income tax collections. Of course, you have this, by the way, they mentioned two things in here which I thought was funny. This is a Bloomberg article. Changing consumer spending patterns, and what they mean is people not spending what they did before. Okay, they've reduced their spending. You don't want to say that because that'll trigger the algorithms, obviously. And then you see the stock market volatility, really meaning that stocks are off their highs. They have gone down. But you can't say bear market, you can't say decline, you can't say crash, you can't say anything that shows negativity because they want to keep the positivity up there when it comes to these type of businesses. They have advertisers and so on. But these are the things. Consumers aren't buying what they did before, and that means that they are going to feel it at the stores. The stores aren't sending those transactions their way to the government, and this has a direct material impact on what the government is able to do. So a lot of this comes at the same time that we see the stock market in this position where they're not doing well. So people feel more wealthy when their house prices are rising, when their stock prices are rising, their 401k is doing better. They're more likely to go out and go to the restaurants, the movies, go to spend money on renovating their house and so on. Initially in 2020, you could have seen a boost in the GDP. And why would that be the case? Well, everybody was suddenly filling up their whole house with toilet paper. So they were buying, going and buying everything, but it wasn't the stuff that maybe they would have said that everything would be healthy. Like when you look at it, okay, people suddenly stop going to the restaurants, but they're buying a lot of toilet paper, certainly. But you look at the data, it's going to tell you that message, and you could see elsewhere, oh, actually everybody was locked down. So this is the case right now today, 2023, we've got buyer patterns that are very different than they were, let's say 2019, because people are feeling the pinch. Inflation has picked up, interest rates have increased, and that has a material impact on, of course, what they're able to afford. So we look at the next aspect here, just shows us that consumers are cutting back, in fact, cutting back on their spending as a result of this. It's pretty clear, okay? Then we look here, inflation in the US finally starting to show signs of cooling, though it remains at fairly high levels across the country. You could see it for yourself. United States of inflation, estimated inflation in the states and selected metro areas and so on. The darker the red, basically the higher the inflation level. And of course, depends where you are, depends on what you buy. Do you have kids in school, textbooks, all those things? No, okay, then that doesn't affect you, all these things. Okay, so it really depends, but you can definitely see that some areas are feeling it more than the rest. What happens? Why is inflation picking up in some areas like, for instance, Florida? Well, part of that is the fact that rent prices have increased a lot and housing prices have increased a lot, and they don't seem to be stopping right now. And so that really pushes up any measure of inflation when you look at this, because there's so many different ways to measure it, but certainly that has an impact on people. People can't afford other stuff if their housing price is really just taking up a large percentage of their income. Looking at the next here, there's a lot actually in this article out of Yahoo Finance. They did a good job with the charts. Where inflation is and isn't, you could see airfare. So if you're not going to go on a flight anywhere, that's not going to hit you, 25.6%. Household energy, hard to deal with that. When it's cold outside, you need to put the heat on. You can only put so many sweaters on and blankets on. Pets and pet product, I've heard from you in the comments before. People are saying like it's just dramatically different than what it was. And not to mention the shrinkflation, because you were used to a certain dog bag, dog food, amount, let's just say, I don't know, let's say it's 10 pounds. Then now it's, oh, if I look carefully, actually it's only 9.2 pounds. They do that and they stretch that out for as long as possible. And the shrinkflation is going to be there for a while. They're going to continue that policy, all of these businesses. Food at home has gone up, clearly. Rent, food at restaurants, housing, and so on. So when you break it down, it all depends on you. But of course, for a lot of people, they have been pushed, really, really pushed to the edge. You can measure this. I don't really like the overall inflation, but I mean, it's difficult to get to the breakdowns all the time. This is just showing us where we are at. It's still elevated, still very high, and that's according to the CPI. People, I see the comments all the time. Why are you quoting the CPI when Shadow Stats has a much higher number? It's very important actually to cover the CPI. Is the CPI actually accurate of inflation? No, it's not. But the CPI is what businesses are looking at. It's what jobs will be affected by, and it's what the stock market is, and your 401ks, retirement accounts, and so on are based on the CPI. The real level of inflation, that's the truth, that's reality. But let's be honest, the businesses don't look at shadow stats. So we need to know both. That's the key. We need to know both, okay? Look here. When you see what's been happening, this just shows us there's many things that I want to show you. U.S. trucking costs, inflation remains elevated, moving stuff, freight, shipping, all of these things are expensive. Yes, they've come down. That's clear, but we are still elevated in many cases. And trucking, just to give you a little bit of insider information, and in fact, if you do drive, let me know. But I move a lot of products around the United States. I ship globally, but definitely in the U.S. It's probably at least triple what I was paying before. It really is. It's like, when you do pallets at a time, skids of units at a time, you could see that. You could really see the difference. UPS, if you're using UPS, it's extremely expensive now compared to what it was, let's say 2019. Even 2020, it wasn't that bad. And now it's gone up. But using other services is still gone up. There's no doubt about that. So I'm feeling the inflation. I can tell you. If you know of any other information, please let me know in the comments below. Here we have just showing us that chart going from 2019 up until now. Across the board, you have higher costs. So that's what's going to have to translate to higher freight rates. We may have seen ocean spot rates come back down to their pre-2020 levels. We're not seeing that in domestic truck transportation. We're not seeing that in domestic rail freight prices either. And if you've been watching the channel, I've been telling you my journey through being an e-commerce seller and what I've been experiencing literally since 2020. So the freight rates had gone up tremendously. That didn't impact me, and I told you about that. However, the trucking, more into like 2022 and now 2023, that I've been definitely feeling it, and it hasn't let up. That chart kind of shows that it's declined a bit. The price, in my opinion, hasn't really let up, at least for me, UPS, as well as using Amazon there as well. So that's just some information for you. Let me look at what's happening in China, because what happens in China then flows back to other countries, the US, UK, Canada, Australia. In China, purchasing manager surveys released will give an indication of how the economy is reopening. The economy's reopening is taking shape, with early signs showing a rebound in consumer activity after the Lunar New Year holidays. That's important because I told you I would give you a little bit of insight. This is the first piece of data that I have for you, just really early data. But in the next week or two, I'll be able to get you a little bit more information, and I'll make sure that those dates are actually relevant. Like it wasn't closed during that period. They closed down for like, maybe about 3 weeks or so. There's really no activity at all. So when they reopen, that's when we get a good sense of what's been happening. So that's that. Now, let me show you the next aspect, which basically is about the markets. That affects you, even if you don't have stocks. Maybe you have a retirement account, maybe you have an IRA, maybe you have an RRSP, a super, whatever it is, depending on where you are. The bear market rally that began in October from reasonable prices and low expectations has morphed into a speculative frenzy based on the Fed pause pivot that isn't coming. That's according to Morgan Stanley. He believes S&P bottoms out at 3,000. That's really not that low when you think about it. It peaked out almost at 5,000. So if it comes down to 3,000, really not an extreme thing. I think it came down to, where was it? Maybe 3,500. I can't even remember at this time. So 3,000, really not something that is too extreme. We'll see. But the reason he mentioned this, and the reason that I think it's relevant, is that it's not about fundamentals. It's not about anything else except for the Federal Reserve. Like, we are going in very tough times. It's getting more difficult. Inflation's picking up. Interest rates are high. And what are they saying? We got to worry about the Fed. That's it. That's all. That's all we need to worry about. And that's why I call it the money mirror method. I'll keep talking about that over and over again. Fed futures curve. What does this mean? Essentially, all you need to know from this is, like, where will the federal funds rate, that the Fed funds rate is basically just the main interest rate for the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States. And, where we were like just a week ago, that, yeah, it's going to be just over 5% there. Don't worry about it. It's all good. Now it's, well, actually, it's probably going to be more like 5.3, 5.4, depending on who you ask. So that is starting to increase, that expectation. As that increases, the reason this is important, the takeaway, is that as that number increases, that belief is that it's going to take longer to cut interest rates on the way down. And so we are in this a lot longer than what the market initially priced in. That's the key. The market had priced in, okay, it's going to be about this. We got enough. We went low enough. That's enough. Let's start to rise up. October, I told you about that before it happened in September. I said, looks like a near-term bottom. There we were. Now, we'll see what happens, but I think that's important to really follow along with that, okay? And then really quickly, this is Goldman Sachs, while our baseline forecast calls for a soft landing and no rate cuts in 2023, our probability-weighted average view implies that the yield curve should nonetheless be somewhat downward sloping. The only thing you need to know from this is that Goldman Sachs expected a soft landing, therefore they wouldn't need to cut interest rates, and so bond market would reflect that. I don't know. I honestly don't know how they're going to get away with that, but this is where we are. This is the important stuff that we talked about today. Inflation is picking up. That has a direct impact on people's ability to spend. If they can't spend on whatever they want, restaurants and so on, well, then they can't, really have an impact. I should say, do good for the economy. The government wants you to spend, right? They want you to spend every last time, even if that means you've got to get into debt. Would you get into debt for the government if they ask you, pretty please, would you mind? Well, you tell me, let me know. I hope this was informative to you. I'm trying to hit those takeaways. I really appreciate when you let me know in the comments. That is something that I do look at every single day, multiple times a day. So thank you very much for being here. I'll see you tomorrow. Take care.